In this shiur in the גיטין, we will deal with the Sa'ifim Vav onwards in Siman Kuf Chafei until Sifyud Beis, which is Beis Gimel, which was finished in the last week, 2 weeks, and there is again very important in the Kudas Negel Ma'asen how to write a get and certain different b'di'evids and lechatchilas that are relevant. Part of what I'm going to discuss today is some things which were already discussed in the introductory shiur by Rabbi Rabin, which gave you a good overview of what the halachas are. Today we're going to go a little bit more into how it plays out in Hilchas גיטין, which is dinim of mukav kvil, chak teiches, and then the end of, and then finishing with the dinim of sirtut. In Sefer of the Mechaber begins that the minig is to be machmir, that every letter should be mukav gvil. Gvil means, the klaf means every letter should have around it some white from the klaf or from the paper, whatever it is. And therefore, if there are letters which got glued together, you should scrape between them to separate them. On this, the Ramah says, Yeshemrim, that you should not scrape and fix, and azay is der minig. That's how we're noyeg. The Rosh writes that some are mekel b'shas adchak. This is often the Ramah. The Maram Padve adds that it's only if before the signing of the Eidim, and only if the husband is the one who told them to be mesaken. All this is the Beis Yosef, name of the Rosh. And this is the Mechaber and the Ramah. Now the Ramah essentially collected three chumras all together, and we're soon going to see how they all play out. What are the svaras for mukav gvil? What are the svaras for greira? Why do we say that? Why some say that you could do it? Why some say that you cannot do it? This is something which comes up, especially when גיטין are written fast, that letters will be attached. Sometimes letters will be broken. And if you are ever at the get, you will see that before. This is you're soon going to see why. But before the Sefer finishes the Lamed of V'Yisrael, Kedas Meisha V'Yisrael, that's when the Rav reviews the get at that point to make any corrections that are necessary. And the idea is before, some should just even before, you're supposed to do it before you finish Kedas Meisha V'Yisrael. Now, what are the svaras why you could do it, or svaras you cannot do this fixing? The Beis Yosef brings the Rivam in Tosfos. The Rivam is medactic from the Tosfos that the Gemara says that you need me'oreh. What does me'oreh mean? That one letter is going into another letter. From that is clear that the letters are not mukav gvil, because if you have a letter that goes, let's say a langenum that goes into a test that's under it, or a lamed that goes into a chaf or a saf that's above it, obviously the letters are no longer mukav gvil. At least that's how it's understood, and therefore the Rivam holds that mukav gvil is not mandatory in the get. Ri in Tosfos holds that it's not a raya. Why? Because the me'oreh that it is the me'oreh which I described to you, not me'oreh that the letters are touching. The Rivam seem to understand that me'oreh is letters touching each other, and therefore not going into each other. Letters touching each other. The Rivam, the Ri, what I explained to you just now, is the way the Ri understands it. The Ri says me'oreh means one letter going into another letter. No, the Rivam seems to understand that they're touching each other. The Ri is the one, I mixed them up, sorry. The Ri is the one that holds that they're going into each other and they're not touching each other.
How are they going into each other?
Like I said, the test, one not touching the letter under it or above it. That it's just going into it without touching it.
Oh,
it's above and below, yes.
Not even above, below.
So what's mashmo is the way it's understood from Rivam is that it's touching each other. That's what me'oreh would be. The top, below, and above. And therefore it's not a raya, because that's the me'oreh the Gemara is talking about. By the way, as a side note, the Ran holds that this kind of me'oreh that the Tosfos that Ri is talking about, that one letter goes into the halal of the ois above it or the ois below it, that is kariv lifseil, karav lepasul. It's almost pasul, and most people disagree with him because it's meshanet tzuras ha'ois. Yeah, but if you look and get Pashut in Sifkot and Chaf, he goes a whole length and says that the shit of the Ran is Das Yachid, and that's not considered Shinui Tzura Sa'ois just because one letter sticks into the Chalal of another letter, and therefore that's just a side note. Re'ila Maskana holds that even if it's not Mukaf Kvil, it's still kosher. Why? Because by a Sefer Torah, Mukaf Kvil is mandatory because it says Ksavtam. Ksavtam is made from two words. Ksivo Kosav and Tam. Ksivo Tamo. That has to be a beautiful writing. By a get, it only says Kosav. And by a get, it says Kosav lo Sefer Krisus. Sefer means Sipur Dvarim. So as long as the Sipur Dvarim is there, if you don't have Ksivo Tamo, you're still fine. Therefore, it's not Ma'akev. I'm just summarizing you what the Beis Yosef says. You should just have a background of the different shittas, the Rambam and the Ramban, the Magid Mishneh, the Ran himself, and the Rashba hold that Mukaf Gvil is not needed as long as you have a Tinnik which reads it and reads it properly, and therefore it is fine. And from that, the Beis Yosef was Medayek that the Rambam and the Ramban and the Magid Mishneh and the Ran and the Rashba all hold that even l'chatchila you don't need Mukaf Gvil, and the Beis Yosef there holds v'chein ikr. But being as if a truma the smak and the smak hold that l'chatchila you do need to have Mukaf Gvil, and not because of the din of Ksivo Tamo, rather because Ksivo Tamo is only a Sefer Torah, but rather because a get has to be read nicely, Nikra Yafeh, which is something you're going to come across later also, which is the whole reason for Sirtut and everything else, one of the reasons for Sirtut, and also the Rosh, and therefore they're all paisel if it's not Mukaf Gvil, unless it's a Mokim Igun, and you cannot bring another get. Lechatchila has to be Mukaf Gvil. The Rosh goes a step further and says that it's possible if it's not Mukaf Gvil unless it's a Mokim Igun, and you cannot bring another get because Ein Shayaras Mitzuyos, which is the definition of the Rosh for Mokim Igun. Definition of the Rosh for Mokim Igun is I can't find another get. Can't get another get done. Now, the Beis Shmuel over here separates, even though the Beis Yosef connected the Smag, the Sefer HaTruma, and the Smak and the Rosh into one category that all say that Mukaf Gvil is L'chatchila, and maybe it's possible unless it's Mokim Igun. The Beis Shmuel separates the two. The Beis Shmuel says the Rosh has one reason. The Smag and the Smak and the Sefer HaTruma are different. The Rosh doesn't mention Bechla the whole reason of beautifying the letters, of Kriya, should be Nikra Yafeh, should be read nicely. Rather, the Rosh only says it's possible, but Mokim Igun. It's possible unless it's Mokim Igun. So the nafkamina that comes out of it is if it's Mukaf Gvil from on top, and it's Mukaf Gvil from the sides, but it's not Mukaf Gvil from the bottom, so then the letter is beautifully read. Just that it's on the bottom, it has a little touch. So therefore, according to the Smag and the Sefer HaTruma and the Smak, it would be kosher l'chatchila, because it's Nikra Yafeh. According to the Rosh, it would still be possible because it's not Mukaf Gvil. The Beis Shmuel continues and says, and the Magid Mishneh that the Beis Yosef mentions also has another detail over there. It's only if a Tinnik could read it, but if a Tinnik cannot read it, then it's possible. And he says that since the Magid Mishneh wrote it on the day of the Rambam, and the Rambam is the one that says L'chatchila, you don't need Mukaf Gvil, and the Magid Mishneh wrote it on the Rambam, it's clear that this heter, that if Tinnik Yochel L'karoi, then it's kosher, but if a Tinnik cannot read it, it's possible, it's only according to the Mekillim. But the ones who passel Mukaf Gvil, without Mukaf Gvil, L'chatchila are paisel even if a Tinnik could read it. The Beis Shmuel is medayik that from the Magid Mishneh. And he says that's how it's mashma from the Smag and from the Rivosh. And if you look in the Pischei Tshuva, you also mashma like that from Maram Lublin. But he says that according to the Rosh and the Tur, it's mashma that if a Tinnik could read it, even though the Rosh is machmir, the Rosh would be make of a Tinnik could read it, it doesn't make it possible. Now, why is it? It's all the Beis Shmuel.
No, who said that even according to Rosh?
According to the Rosh, it's not possible if a Tinnik reads it.
You just said that it is possible.
According to the way it's mashma from the Smag and the Rivosh, and the Magid Mishneh, the way the Bishmuel understands him. But he says, but the Rosh, who is in the category of the Machmirim, the way the Rosh, the Paskins regarding Nofla Tipas Diyah and Seif Ches, it's mashma that he holds that it's mukaf, that if a Tinnik is koide, it's kosher.
So according to the people that are Mekel, they would hold that the Rosh is Machmir, but really the Rosh is Mekel.
The Rosh is Mekel compared to the rest of the Machmirim, and he's...
The other Machmirim hold that it's kosher together.
And the Rosh also holds kosher b'diavad, b'mokim igun. Yeah, and they also hold it's kosher, but the Pile hold it's kosher.
No, the Rosh hold it kosher.
It's possible and it's kosher mokim igun. The other ones hold it's lachatchila. Yeah, so the Rosh, it says it's possible mokim igun. The strictest of them is it's possible unless it's mokim igun. He would hold that if it's the way the Bishmuel understands the Rosh, he would hold that if a tinnik koide, then it's fine.
But he's more Mekel than one power.
Yes. Now, regarding separating letters that are touching each other, and obviously the Tinnik reads them properly, and the etc. The Beis Yosef brings the Rosh and the Sefer HaTruma and the Mordechai that if the letters are touching each other, you could be guided, you could erase in between the letters, and it's not considered chak teichos. It's not considered that you created a new letter just because of the negiah between them. And even in Tefillin it does work. Elamai, the Beis Yosef is medayek from the Rosh that you could only do the Greda if the Baal appoints it. So now, why is it not considered chak teichos in this scenario when you're separating two letters that are glued together? Fully or not fully, we'll soon see. Chakaz Mechakik says is because ultimately you're not touching the actual ice. All you're touching is the ois is there. Both oisias are each one independently existent. And all you're doing is you're taking a dot that connected the two together, or a little bit more than a dot, and you're separating them, but the letters are still in existence. They were existing before, and they're existing now. For a separate reason. Why do you need tzivu in such a scenario? It's already written. The question is if you could touch something in the get. He's still, you can't give the get like that. The Sefer is the one who's supposed to deliver a kosher get. Prepare a kosher get, a proper ksiva. So if somebody else does it, the way the Beis Yosef is attacked from the Rosh, you need to have a tzivui habal, for it. Now, the question that comes up is why by a get, l'chatchila we don't do greater, by a tefillin we do. And the Chelkas Mechaykek says, and the Beis Shmuel brings it, very simple, tefillin, if you mess up, then it goes to Gniza. By a get, if you mess it up, you rip it up, put it in the garbage, and write a new one. So therefore, by a tefillin, it always becomes a b'diavad. Because you always have to throw it out unless you messed up on the first word, and even then it's a shayla. But if by a get there's no such thing, so it always remains l'chatchila. You could throw it. You could throw it. Now, why b'shas atchak you could be mesaken before the eidim sign it? The Chelkas Mechaykek points out something. He says l'chayda according to the Ramah that l'chatchila it's possible. If the Eidim already signed it on a get puzzle, the chsime helft garnished, and therefore you won't be able to sign it. You won't be able to do anything. It will be a get puzzle, and the signature will have no validity. Therefore, you would have to have it done before the chsime of the Eidim. So that way, the get should remain. You should have a kosher to get that the Eidim should be able to sign on, because otherwise the Eidim's signature was on something which was not kosher, and their signature has no validity and no power to achieve anything. Why do you need a tzivui abal? He says because nobody has a reshus. The Chelkas B'chagig says Pasha because nobody has a reshus except for the husband is the one who does it, and he has a reshus. Or from the husband, the only person who had a reshus to fix is a sefer.
So why didn't he do the reshus?
Huh?
He had already the reshus.
What do you mean he has a reshus?
So he already had a reshus to write.
The reshus to write, not the reshus to erase. At least not in that generation. Until the Kavnoki didn't have a reshus to erase. The Chelkas B'chagig explains, the Kavnoki changed the Nusach. We'll get to it soon. The Chelkas B'chagig continues that if you read the Ramah simply, it's much from the Ramah that even after, that even B'Mokimigun, and even if the husband appointed is Mitzaveh, if the Chasim already happened, you can't fix it. And that's how the Bishmul also understood it, because the Bishmul understood that the Ramah took all three independent Chumras from each one and connected them all together. You have to be before Chasim, and you have to do B'tzivuy Abal, and it has to be B'shas Atchak. So therefore, if you have only 2 out of 3, according to Mashmos Ramah, it's not good. And that's how the Bishmul also understood it. And the Chelkas B'chagig says, the Rosh was the Yesod for this Chumrah, it doesn't say so. From the Rosh, it's mashma that even without Tzivuy Abal, and even after the get is signed by the Eidim, you could still fix it, because the Rosh's only condition was Shas Atchak Mokamigun. And therefore the Chelkas B'chagig paskins la halacha that if a tinoik reads it, because this is, don't forget, the tinoik Yesod is from the Rosh, if a tinoik reads it without any scraping, then B'shas Atchak and Mokamigun you could do even without Tzivuy Abal. And if a tinoik cannot read it, then erasing it won't help anything. Because, Ba'atzim it's kosher. You have to erase it. It should be read properly. According to the Rosh, if a tinoik reads it, that's when you could erase it.
What do you mean? You said before
if according to the Rosh, if a tinoik reads it, is when you could erase it. Because erasing is one thing, and tinoik reading is the definition. When could the Rosh Svara is that Chak Teiches doesn't apply if a tinoik could read it properly. Therefore, but greater you still have to do, because the letters are connected. Because you need Mukav Gvil at the end of the day. You need Mukav Gvil, so therefore you have to scrape it. When could you scrape it? Only if it's not Chak Teiches. When is it not Chak Teiches? If a tinoik reads it properly. Why is that so? Because that means that the letters are clearly defined by each other. Each letter is clearly defined, and not the shtan. But if a tinoik doesn't read it, then it means the shtan tzura means that there's no clear letter over here. Means if you're going to scrape it, it's going to be Chak Teiches. If it's going to be Chak Teiches, it's going to be shayla, becomes pasul or batul, which is going to be machlikas later on. If Chak Teiches in such a scenario is pasul or batul, and according to the Chelkas B'chagig, according to this.
Even by stam, David said it. Even by stam, touching letters, you're able to scrape it off, no?
Yeah, but when?
Even if a kid can't read it, no?
No, if a kid.
In other words, the problem is not the eyes, the problem is just that they're touching. It's not a problem.
But that depends. That's what the Rosh says. That by a get, if it's touching, and you cannot, and that's what the Rosh says, by a get, if it's touching, and the tinoik cannot define one letter from the other, separate the letters, and can't read the letters properly, then you can't even do the scraping. It becomes a Chak Teiches. The Taz brings a couple of interesting, important klalim that are relevant to this. The Taz over here says some of them are already repeated in previous Mefarshim, and some of them are original for the Taz. First of all, he says that this is that you have to ask the husband to give a tzivui, so he doesn't understand the chumra d'asli kula. Why? Because if there's a new tzivui, we're going to get hefsek with the ksiv and the sin. Now you had the one tzivui, you had all the tzivuim before, regarding the ksiv, then you have the v'kosav, then you have to do the v'nazon. But now if the husband is going to do new tzivuyim as part of the new tzivui to erase, you created a new step between the v'kosav and the nasan. Right now you have a kosav, u'mochak, v'nasan. So therefore it's a chumra d'asli kula, it's better b'chol to do it. And therefore he says that the understanding of the Rosh is not that the sofer gets a new tzivui. is that this Sefer is the only one who can do it because he was already nitztava from the husband to write a get. Therefore, that included in it also the erasing that's needed. And therefore, when the Rosh says "B'lo tzivui abal," means somebody was not the Sefer, because the Sefer already has a tzivui abal to write. And he says that's how you also see it in Seder Laget to the Marid.
So again, the meaning is to do the whole thing, to erase it, to fix it, to everything. Right?
Today the minig is you. Today the original tzivui includes everything. Yes. But again, that's added by the Kavnaki into the Seder Laget to the Maramri. Most people don't even know that it was added into it because he added it into the top, into the actual Seder Laget. He didn't add it as a foot, no, as a bir. He added it into the top in brackets, square brackets. And everybody just reads the Nusach straight from the Kadawetz and Kavnaki, so it just became part of the next ones that typed up the Seder Laget for the Botei Din. They took out all the brackets, they just made it into one long Nusach. A few additions from the Kavnaki that solved a lot of problems that were put into the Seder Laget, and today you're not going to find any Bezdin which doesn't say it because it's part of the Nusach. A lot of them never even checked to see where it came from, but it's there. You look in the Kavnaki, you see that it's there. The next thing, what the Ramah says that you cannot separate two letters, it's referring to when the whole ois is connected. That means, let's say it's a aleph and a mem, the whole end of the aleph is connected to the mem. Not that there's a hairline connection, or there's one line, or there's a mosquito jumped in the middle and sat over there, or a bug or something, just a little line. That, and he follows like the Bach. He follows the Shver of the Bach. That's not a problem. That's l'chatchila. You could separate it. It's b'chal not a shayla, even according to the Ramah. He says if the get was already signed, the third point of the Taz, if the get was already signed, but it was not given yet, l'chatchila yesh machmirim. You should write a new one. Yeah, that's the shit of the yesh machmirim. But if it was already given, it became a b'di'evid, and b'di'evid it's kuli alma, it's kosher. And he says, however, some are makel to do the scraping before the sin. If it wasn't given yet, scrape it. And he says that's how he's medayik from the Rosh. Similar to what the Chalak is medayik from the Rosh, that b'mokim igun shasachak, when you're allowed to do greira, it doesn't have to be before chsimas eidim. Because Shas Chakam Mokim Igun is matir the greater in these scenarios. But if you look in the Beis Shmuel, he says if it was written and it was not signed, if it was written and signed, but it was not given yet, if it was written and signed but not given yet, at that point the get is already kosher. Because it's already, Shas Chakam Mokim Igun, the get is kosher. And it doesn't have to be scraped. It's better to do so, but only because of Madasayin. He disagrees in the Taz. The Taz says you can scrape even afterwards. The Beis Shmuel says no. Medina, it's kosher. Elamai is Ma'ariv sign. People are going to think you could write a get when the oisis and the gay each other. Therefore, it's better to do it, but you don't have to. However, if the Eidim did not sign yet, that's when the Ramah kicks in, that l'chatchila you should be able to fix it. The Pri Chodosh over here comes with an interesting chumrah. He says, from the lashon of the mechaber, it's mashma that it's only talking about two letters which touched each other, but not a letter which it in itself touched itself. The hain like a shin where the keplach touched each other, or a pei where the yud rolled up to the top, or a kuf where the leg went up. And he says if it's a letter which touched itself, then scraping it becomes a chok teiches. And he says that's from the Maralbach. The next thing he says now the same, he brings in the same Maralbach, that if it's a hairline negia, let's say by a hay, the example of the Maralbach, by a hay, that there's a hairline negia from the leg of the hay to the top, so technically it's a ches. But if you give it to a child to read, he's going to read it as a hay because it's such a tiny negia. The Maralbach says, I won't be moiche against somebody who's mekel. And the Pri Chodosh says, I will be moiche. And I will not be moiche in such a scenario. If it does touch in such a way that it becomes a new letter, you're not allowed to fix it, and it becomes chak teiches, even though the Maralbach is the one that's machmir and says that when the letter touches itself, it becomes chak teiches. The Pri Chador says, I'm going a step further than the Maralbach. Maralbach says, I'm not going to be meiche, I will be meiche, you shouldn't do it. The next thing he brings from the Ramemi Pana, another interesting nekuda that the Pri Chador brings, and this is also a big machlekes, which there's two extreme deis when it comes to this. When could you fix it? The Ramemi Pana says that when could you fix a negia? Only if the negia happened after the letter was completely written. That means you wrote completely the hey, or the mem, and afterwards, after was a complete, full, kosher mem, it got a negia to the next letter. But if the next letter was written in such a way that it started with a negia, that means it never had a tzuras eis. If it never had a tzuras eis, when you are scraping it, you're making a chak teiches, and it's also. You're completing the shape through this. And what does it mean that the nishlam ha'ois? So here the Rashba says that as long as, the Rashba takes the exact opposite approach. As long as you didn't remove your hand from the letter, you could still fix it. That means if you still have the kulmas on the letter, that means that the letter, you didn't finish writing the letter, you could already do it, which is exactly the opposite of the Ramemi Pan.
It's not exactly the opposite.
It's a middle, but the Ramemi, yeah, and he's medayik. He says no. For the sefer truma, it's mashma. It doesn't make a difference. Nigmar is nigmar. You can always be misaken. He says when the Ramah says the b'shasat chakam or kemigun, you could be guided it. It's only the sofer himself and not somebody else, and not another sofer. And he says that's the mashmos of the Rosh. It means he understands it the same way as the Taz, and he says it's clearly written in the Maribal, Mariban Lev. That only the sofer himself, the sofer was nisman from the husband, is the one who could do the mechikas. And he also continues, he takes the same approach as the Beis Shmuel. The Ramah over here connected all the chumras together, and it makes no sense, because each chumrah is independent, and you can't combine all the three chumras together. He says the majority of the poskim already disagreed with it. In Get Pashut, in Sifkot and Chaf, deals regarding the topic of negias, and the topic of one letter going into another letter. For example, if the top of the lamed goes into a hey or into a ches, or the leg of the langechaf or the leg of the nun goes into a tes, that's under it. Okay, it's that we mentioned before that the Beis Yosef brings the Ran, that the Ran says that it's possible. That's cut of the puzzle. And the Get Pashut says, according to the Ri and the Rivam and Taisvis and the Ramban, and then almost everybody else, there's absolutely no kfeda in that. It doesn't make it possible. But then he goes from that into another, into the nekuda of negia. He goes to the nekuda of tinik. He says, if a tinik does not read it properly, the kuli alma or roiva paiskim say it's possible. But when he continues this, if got the chafalaf, it only applies in toiref aget, not in toifus. Toifus, even if a tinik does not read it properly, you could still scrape it and it still remains kosher. If a kid cannot read it, you cannot fix it. It's possible. In the toiref only. That's how he understands it.
According to this, the Rosh is more make. I mean, whatever. The Rosh, the Shmuel is more make.
Yeah, but he doesn't agree. He doesn't follow the Bishmul. The Get Pashut separates them differently. He says tinik kairoi is only needed for the toiref, and without it, it's completely possible and helpless. And the toifus, even if tinik is not kairoi, you could fix it. He says another point, even those who are machmir regarding negias, if the negia is in the toifus, not in the toilef, and it's a shas adchak, you could be mekel. But there's one condition, there's one caveat to it, that it has to make sure that the negiah did not create a shinu in the mashmos aget, a change in the understanding of what the get means. That's now it no longer implies that there's a gerushin over here, or it's in a certain words in the get, which you're going to learn later on, that even if you skip the letters completely, the get is still kosher. Huh? Toifus, and toilef it's also. He says those that are machmir, if it's after nesina and it's in a toifus and it's a shas adchak, it could be mekel. And he says, then he goes to the next point, in the negiah, which is poisel, which we said according to a lot of poskim, negiah is poisel lechatchila unless it's shas adchak amakim migun. He says if it's only the tagim touching each other, it's in the Sefer Torah, people are matter. In the get, you don't have tagim, you only have uktzin in certain ones. This is what in the Sefer Torah is some of them. A lot of people are mekel with tagim, and therefore, by a hairline negiah in a get, we're also mekel, like the taz. If the letter got glued to itself, got connected to itself, which a pri chadash is extreme, that it's asur, that's pasul. The get pasha says no. If the letter is nikar, it's kosher. In Sifkot Nechafei, the Get Pashat says, but this is a one-off heter. That means all these heterim of negias is when you have one. It doesn't say maybe two, but maybe two, same thing. But if the whole thing is full of negias, basically the sefer is sloppy, he says, the Pnei Moshe says you can't do it because it looks like a menumar. It's full of dots and one. It's a mess. And if it's a mess, you're not supposed to give such a get. But he says, even though the Pnei Moshe says you shouldn't do it, the Ma'arik says it's fine. And he says from the Ma'arik it's mashma that it's kosher even l'chatchila, and it's kosher even l'chatchila when it's this negiah. And the Ma'arik says that if it's negiah in a kuf, then l'chatchila it's asur, and b'shas adchak it's mutar. Regarding the husbands giving a tzivui to do the greater, he writes in Sifkot Nechaf Ches, there's no need for a new tzivui if the sefer is the one who does it, and he says, and he tells you some historical facts. Ra'isi l'Rabbanim Sfadim l'Memunim Agiti, the Avdi Uvda Shigre Rasofer, Nibukaisis B'li tzivui Abal. He says, I saw the Rabbanim are achroi on the gitin, they would do it without having any new tzivui. The sefer would do it without having any new tzivui from the Baal. And in Sifkot Nechaf Tes, he says that what it says, the Ramos says they should fix it before Chsima Sa'edim. He says, if you look and say that I get Mari Mintz, it's not before Chsima Sa'edim means before writing Kedas Moshe V'Yisro, not afterwards. Torah's Gitin, in Biurim Sifkot Hey, says that if you have a complete psul in the get, for example, an extra letter, and it's in the toiref, not in the toifus, then you must have the sefer do the work. Why? Because the sefer is a shliach habal. Now, the Torah's Gitin l'shitosei that the kasav is medin shlichus, not medin l'shma. And he went a few times that we saw it previously. But he says that in the Shas Adchak, somebody who is not shliach habal could still do it, but not if it's a psul gomer. If it's a negiah, it could be done by somebody who's not shliach habal. But if it's a psul gomer, it needs to be done by shliach habal. And even b'shas adchak has to be done. Even b'shas adchak, it's only kosher if shliach habal erases the psul gomer. But the sefer is considered shliach habal; he could do it. Now, what happens if the chibur is in the chsima of the Edom, and the signature of the Edom were not such professional seferim, and their letters touched each other? being that according to Reva Poiskim, even by Chasima saying you have to be makpid, that it should be mukaf gvil, so obviously that's how it should be done. But if it's a mukaf migun b'diavad, he says yesh emrim that you could erase the nagia, and yesh emrim that it's kosher as is, don't touch it, and leave it as is and give it. Now what happens if the touching of the letters is not because of the ink, it's not because of the sefer, it's because the paper was not perfect paper, and it has some from the production, it has some leftover, some dirt on it that got stuck over there, or it collected dirt on the way in the bag or whatever it is where the paper was kept. Later Behuda and Ebenezer Kufyat Gimel says kosher. But he says, but if it's clear that it's ink or something of the sort, even if it's not the ink that the sefer used, that means there was ink, that a blotch of ink, a dot of ink is on the paper that was used for the get, and you didn't check the paper beforehand to check it properly, then you have the psak of the Marasham, and Chelik Beis Kuf Pei Vav, L'chatchila you shouldn't give it.
If it's overall, not a problem, but if it's good, it's a problem.
Yeah, according to the Marasham. Yeah. Now, if you could only tell the touching of the two letters through a magnifying glass, the Shas of Tshuva is Doivev Meshonim from the Chabin Rav, Chedekal of Siman Aleph, the first Tshuva in his first volume.
If it's connected?
It's connected, but you could only see it through a magnifying glass, the connection. He says, by Sefer Torah, it's kosher. We'll need to tell him Malachi Asharis. By the way, since we're anyways dealing over here, people learn Hilchos Nida, you have the same thing when it comes to Hilchos Nida. Also, if something is only seen in magnifying glass, you have a tshuva from the Karlsburger Rav, from Chatzkorot, that also is the same idea. If it's only seen in a magnifying glass and without it you don't see anything, then it's fine. Therefore, you should not be using magnifying glasses unless you see something and then you need to check it. And even then, if you need it, it's if you use it, you get used to it. You shouldn't get used to it. Now, what's the other way around? If you have a negia that you see, but then you took a magnifying glass and you enlarged it and you see that there's no negia, the Chelkas Yaakov says that regarding Sefer Torah, it's kosher. Same thing. So we use it both ways. If it's a negia that's only seen through a magnifying glass, it's kosher because you don't rely on the magnifying glass. And if it's not a negia, you could only tell that it's not a negia through a magnifying glass because there's a hairline split between the two, and you can only tell with a magnifying glass, the Chelkas Yaakov says that Lein Sefer Torah is kosher. Now, what happens if you wrote a get, and it's mukaf gvil like you're supposed to? After the get was written, somehow, maybe the ink was too wet, and it created a little hole next to the end of the letter. And what happened is that now, at that side of the letter, it's no longer mukaf gvil, because there's a hole. So it was mukaf gvil when you wrote it. It's no longer mukaf gvil now. So when you're writing a Sefer Torah, by Sefer Torah Tefillah Mezuzos, it's kosher. It's the Alter Rebbe writes in Siman Lamed Beis Sifit Ches. The Knesset Agdela writes the same thing that's in Siman Lamed Beis. He's not talking about the Alter Rebbe, it's before the Alter Rebbe, but he says the same. The Alter Rebbe took it from the Mechaber. He says that what's in Siman Lamed Beis applies also to a get. Now, if there was a hole beforehand, and the Sefer was not paying attention, and he wrote the letter up until the hole, which means that the letter was not mukaf kvil lechatchila, Alter Rebbe writes in Sifte Zayin that you could be greater, you could do greater in such a scenario. By Stam, doesn't discuss about gitin. Now, if there was a hole, but when you wrote the letter, you wrote above the hole, and the ink filled up the hole and it dried up and there's no more hole over there, the Alter Rebbe writes in Sif Yud Zayin and Siman Lamed Beis, it's kosher. Now, what happens if you're talking about a letter where the mukaf kvil is on the outside but not on the inside, which means you have a ches, and then the inside of the ches some part of it created a hole. So therefore you have mukaf kvil on the outside but not mukaf kvil on the inside. The Alter Rebbe, like a hey or a mem, okay, the Alter Rebbe brings 2 days in Sif Yutes. One day, first day that's kosher, Second day that it's not kosher. Alter Rebbe says Ikar Kisvara Rishena, Yishlachos that's kosher, Yishlachos Svara Achreina, that it's possible. And he says V'nochin lahachmir, even if this hole appeared after the writing. Now, if it created afterwards, but this is Alter Rebbe concludes after writing everything that if it happened afterwards, toiv lahachmir, nochin lahachmir. Yeah, it was done before. So therefore, the shaila is if you could be goyder or not. In Seder Getrishna the Maramri in Siman Pei Aleph and Ois Beis, he says the Baal doesn't have to be metzaveh absolutely any tikkunim, and anybody else can be mesaken. But who? Only if the Rav HaMesader is the one who tells him to do the tikkunim. And without the Rav saying such a thing, even the Sofer should not be mesaken anything, even though he's a appointee of the husband. The Kavnoki in Sifkot Lamed Zayin over there says what we already know, that you have to do it, you should fix it before writing Kedas Moshe Yisrael. And he says a klal. Any place where it says that anybody could fix something, you don't need Tzivui Abal, you don't need Tzivui Arav. Any place, if they're not here anymore. But if it says specifically he has to appoint it, he has to do, if it's something that specifically the Sefer has to do, then the Sefer has to do, and you can only do that with the Rav. Like I told you, to prevent this whole problem, the Kavnoki fixed the Nusach of Minui HaSefer for the way it was in Maramri, and it's in Seder Getrish and Siman and Beis, and he adds over there, when you write, and Noisen L'cha Reshus Leichtoiv, Hein al Aniyar v'Hein al Mechak. I give you Reshus to write, whether it is on the actual paper, or if you erase, to continue writing it, which means you're giving the header to write, to erase, to write again. And this point is also mentioned in the Get Mekusha. The Pischei Tshuva mentions it also. This is as what it pertains to Seif Vav. Let's move to Seif Ches, which is Chak Teiches. If a drop of ink falls inside the letter, and the letter is no longer visible, the Mechaber says you cannot scrape the ink to now a new letter should show up from it, because this is Chak Teiches. And the Ramah says Yesh Machmirim, even if the letter is still recognizable, and that is the minhag that we do not, if there is, even if the letter is recognizable, we still do not scrape a drop of ink that fell on a letter. How do you fix such a thing? The Chalakas Mechagig brings from the Bach that you have to scrape the whole letter which was written, which became, so to speak, puzzle, and then you write next to what you scraped. Why? Because you can't write on top of a machak because it's Yachol is Dayef. And therefore the Bach says it's only possible if you realized it right before you continued writing. So you're able to scrape what you scraped, leave the scraped part over there, and continue writing after the scrape. Huh? You scrape, you erase the puzzle letter, and then you continue writing after the place where it's erased. You don't write on top of the place that you erased. The Chalakas Mechagig said, I don't understand what this is doing. This helps nothing. He says, the same way, if you have a chashash that you shouldn't write on something which was erased because Yochel is Dayef, if the same chashash, you shouldn't leave a blank spot that was erased, because somebody's going to start asking, oh, let me check, what was erased over here? Maybe there was something hidden over here that they erased. So the same chashash Yochel is Dayef is in both places. So he says, that Nekuda of the Bach, I don't understand. Then he says, go look in the Bach who disagrees on the Levush regarding the difference between Lach and Yavish, wet ink and dry ink. But he doesn't tell you what else. He tells you go look in the Bach and go look at the Levush. So let's look at the Levush before we look at the Bach. There's no point looking at the Bach before you know what the Levush says. The Levush makes a list of a bunch of klalim regarding erasing. It's in Sif Tes in the Levush. Some of the things you already know from the Ramah, and some of the things is original Levush. He says like this: Yesh Omrim, that even if the letter is recognized after the drop of ink falls in it, you cannot scrape the ink so that the letter that's there should look nice. Why? Because then it's considered chak teichus and it's possible. Next point. If the drop of ink fell in a letter after the letter was already completely written, we're still machmir not to scrape the extra ink that fell, and we say it's possible. Even though we can say that nigmar ois, it should still be fine. Third point, yesh omrim, that chak teichus is only if the scraping, the erasing, is what makes the letter complete. But if the scraping is going to just make it, you still have to do extra work on it. This is something which we already heard, which we already discussed in the previous shiur. If the letter is going to add, the letter still needs more work, then it's not considered chak teichus. On this, after these three yeshayimlims, comes Levush and adds his own thing. This is only if the drop of ink fell on top of the letter when the first letter that was under it was still wet. Because then both inks got mixed together. And when are you going to go scraping it? After it dries. When it dries, you have no idea what ink was the ink that you wrote with. What ink is the ink that fell? So it could be that you're going to erase the ink that you wrote with, and the ink that you're going to create the letter from is going to be the ink that is chak teichus, and it's possible. Or at least chak teichus or miktas ois, part of the letter. But if the first letter that you wrote is completely dry, and the get was already signed, and then afterwards ink fell on top of it, the Levush says that kulei alma you're allowed to. You're allowed to scrape the ink, the new ink from around it, only if the letter is nicker. If the letter is not nicker, it's a bigger problem. Why? Because like this, the original ksav will remain. The original ksav is there, and it's dry, and it's existing. And all you're erasing is the extra ink. So therefore, you're not touching the original letter. So all you're doing is you're removing something which is blocking the letter which is kosher. What would it be doime to? If you would have a letter, and on top of the letter you put a piece of paper. Essentially, that's how the Levush understands it. You have a full letter, you put a piece of paper, you can't read it now. What are you going to do? Peel off the sticker. You peeled off the sticker, the letter is visible again. So, does that make it puzzle? He says, l'kuli alma it's kosher. He still says, l'chatchili, you should be machmir, because whatever reason, some people are machmir in it, but in k'tzas asat chak, you already could be mekel. Happens to be the drisha on the Torah just is mitzayin to the Levush, and that's it, doesn't argue with him, doesn't disagree with him. Seems like the drisha passes like the Levush. There is a difference between lach and yavish. The Bach says, I don't understand. This is the Bach that we mentioned before, that the Chalkas Mechekek says, look at the Bach who doesn't agree with Levush. So what does the Bach say on this whole Levush? The Bach says, I don't like what the Levush says. Because this chiluk is only based according to the smak which the Beis Yosef brings. But the Hagoyes on the smak itself says that Rabbeinu Baruch disagrees with it. And therefore the Bach passes in any whether it was wet, whether it was dry. The Taz, also in Sifkot and Tes over here, follows like a shver, like the Bach, and also disagrees on the Levush. But the Taz brings another svara. The Taz says, why is this? He says, if somebody goes and digs a pit in Mishus Arabim, and then his friend comes and fills up the pit, this batel, ma'aser rishon legamrei. The first person's action is completely batel. Now what's going to happen? The third person is going to come and dig it out. The original digger It's completely butter. Didn't do anything. The Meiser is completely butter. It was filled up. You made a pothole, you filled it up, it's done. It's ice pothole. Comes the next person, makes a new pothole. It's a new pothole. It's not reopening the old pothole. So over here, when the ink falls on top of this dioi, on top of this letter, the tipas dioi falls on top of this letter, and this battle, Meiser Rishon Lagamri. Now, is this the Iraisa or the Rabbanon? Is it Pasel or is it Batel? The Ramah, the Mechaber don't say Pasel or Batel. The Beis Shmuel, Sifkot Yudalef says that when it's Nafal Tipas Yeh and it's not Nikr and you cannot tell what the letter is, it's Mashma that it's Batel Midiraisa. And he says there's no difference between Lachbet and Yavish. He's Machmer, like the Bach, like the Taz, not like the Levush. Interesting, the Beis Shmuel brings the beard of the Maram Ri on the Levush, which then makes the Levush not disagree with him, with everybody else. He says, the Bach, essentially saying the Bach and the Taz misunderstood the Levush. He says the Levush is talking only when not Nishtanet Tzura Sois Bichlal. And it didn't even go out of the letter. That means the drop fell, and it perfectly fell right on top of the letter. So what happens now? You have a letter, and on top of it you have wet ink. So that wet ink, it's annoying, you go take a tissue and take it off. That's not a problem. Because that extra ink didn't do any change to the letter. That's what the Levush is talking about. So you want to give the get now. You want to give the get, you're worried it's going to spread more. So the letter wasn't a skalkel b'chlal. There's no change b'chlal in the letter. It's not that the letter you could tell. The tzura sois is still beautifully written. And then he says, there's no, the kasha of the Bach and the Levush doesn't apply. And the Beis Shmuel says, but ba'etzem, there's a tikkun to all this. You could always scrape the whole thing and write again. And even though you don't do the Beis Shmuel. Even though the Chatchila you don't do mechak in the get, you don't erase in the get, still no, Shazachak is kosher. And he says, and if you're going to look in the Taz, later in Sif Tazvav, which we didn't get to yet, the Taz did it l'Chatchila. Well, it's not really the Taz. The Rabbi Akiva says it's not really the Taz. The Taz says a story about his brother, that his brother was a Rav who had to deal with a get of a mumor, and over there Tipas Yoy fell, and he relied on Eidem Asira. Happens to be the Beis Shmuel doesn't mention B'chal Eidem Asira. It seems like the Beis Shmuel says, okay, it's Shazat Chak, you could do it. And he takes the story of the Taz, and he pulls out of it that B'Shazat Chak you could do it. The Rabbi Akiva Eiger says, hey, slow down on that B'Shazat Chak, because the same Taz that you want to quote gave you specifics in the story. It was a mumor, and he relied on the Eidem Asira. The Beis Shmuel also says if the mistake, if this issue happens. What do you mean? Because Ba'atzim it's kosher.
The get was not written properly.
The get was written properly. The get was written properly, and you had to erase it. And he says, because what's the reason why you don't erase? Because chashash ziyuf, right? So everything is it's kosher. The Beis Shmuel says that if such a thing happened and nafal tipas diyah happened in the chsim of the Eidim, then the chatchila you could erase it. You don't even have to. It's not but the chatchila you could erase it and you could write. But if the Eidim already finished signing everything, there's no more takanas for erasing and in the get. If the Eidim already signed, then you could only fix the Eidim signature. The Eidim could fix their own signatures, but you can't fix the get already. The get is already kaput. The Chalkas Mechoykek mentions, the Ramah says, Yesh Machmirim, even if the letter is Nikr. And the Chalkas Mechoykek says, I don't understand. If the idea is that you have to be Machmir L'Chatchila, so you don't have to write it. And if the idea is that you want to be Machmir B'di'evid, even by the evidence, if the ois is not nikar, the maharik, who is the yesoid of the mocker of the Ramah, doesn't write this, but the evidence possible. Shmuel points out the same thing. Basically, they disagree with the Ramah. So you don't understand this chumrah. Now, and we'll soon see other people do explain this chumrah. The get pashut in Sifkat Lamed Beis it brings a diuk from the lashon of the mechaber. The mechaber says that it fell besoicha ois, inside the letter. That means that if it fell outside the letter, in between the lines, you for sure could erase it. But if it falls inside the letter, then you can't erase it at all, even if it's not touching. That's the chatchila. He says that's what it seems like. He says no, but it's not exactly what it is. It means that over here we come into the whole idea of the tinaik. He says if it fell into the halal of the letter, means let's say a drop fell into the middle of a shlasmem, it's not touching anywhere, but now the shlasmem has a dot inside, or a ches has a dot inside and became, or a tuf or a beis got a dot inside, now it became a beis and not a vase. So he says, if a tiner could read it properly, you could erase it. If a tiner cannot read it properly, you cannot erase it. That is how he understands the mechaber. And he says, this is a chumra yisera. And he doesn't agree with that chumra. He says that l'chayr, if it's not touching the letter, you could always erase it. The only discussion would be if you were the dalet and a drop fell under it, now it looks like a hay. That's a separate discussion, which we're going to get to later. In Sifkat and Lamed Gimel, the get pashut goes into the discussion I mentioned before. Do you have to erase the whole letter when you had a nafal tipas diyay, or only part of the letter? And he says, the Mari ben Chaviv says that it's enough to just erase part of it until it no longer looks like a ois. So if it's messed up at daled, you could leave the top or the side or whatever it is. Or if it's a ayin and it looks like a, you could, until it's nishchas tzuras ha'ois, the tzura of the ois is completely eliminated. And then you could complete the letter and make it properly. And according to the Machmir, and people disagree with the Mari ben Chaviv, you have to erase the whole thing. This is what we saw already before from the Bach, or from the Taz. You have to erase the whole thing and you have to rewrite it. In Sifkat and Lamed Hey, he brings from the Mari Kash, that if, and this is an interesting thing, if you had, let's say you had to write the date, right? So you write this amount Yomim LeYerach Adar Harishain, Harishain, it's Adar Aleph. So now what happens is, if you wrote, we'll give you an example, Adar Harishain, and between the shin and the vav, you gechapt and you left a gap. So now it's read like harosh, vav nun. You have to connect the two together. So what are you going to do? So the Mari Kash says, make a fourth. He says you could make a fourth leg to the shin. Now a shin with 4 heads. And then, in the space, in the gap between the shin and the vav, make a 4th leg. Then you could erase, and you could thicken the other one, erase another one, and thicken it. It's not considered chak teiches. Why? Because the shin of 4 heads is considered a shin. And you didn't create a new letter. It's a shin, and it's still a shin. It's a shin with 4. He still says better to first erase one of the 3, and then add. It means erase the one on the right, and then add a big one on the left, or whatever it is. The Get Pashut says this is not so. There's no such a thing of a shin of four heads. The shin of 4 heads is not a shin of 4 heads. It's a chakel, the reflection, the white in between the 4 is a shin. That's why you have, when you have in the tefillin, it's one represents the white, one represents the black. So what did you do now? When you wrote a 4, you created a white shin. When you erased the 4th leg, you right now went and created a black shin out of a white shin. So it's chak teiches. And therefore, it's completely possible. Unless you erase one first. Okay, he disagrees completely with Marikash, it's completely possible. In Sifkot Lamed Vav, he says what happens if you added, if you wrote two words. Let's say Liyerach Adar Harishon. Yeah, you're supposed to write Liyerach Adar. And between the Ches of Liyerach and the Aleph of Adar, without realizing, you put another Aleph. So it became Liyerach Aleph Adar. Yeah, it looks like one long word. Now, if you erase the Aleph between Liyerach and Adar Harishon, you created two words. Is there chak teiches by creating two words? Or chak teiches is only by creating a letter? The same thing, if you had to write the beginning of a line, you had to write Shimon, and you started with the Aleph, Ashimon. Now, there's no name Ashimon. But if you're going to erase the Aleph, you created a new word, Shimon. Is the concept of chak teiches apply to creating a word? You're not creating a letter, the letters are all there. You're creating a word. And he says, mashma from the Beis Yosef and Nuchas Sefer and the end of simulation, that's not a problem. Now what happens if you have a reish? You wrote a reish instead of a daled. Now you want to add a tail to the reish to make it a daled. Or you wrote a chaf instead of a beis. Or, faket, you wrote a daled instead of a reish, and you want to thicken it to make a reish. What's the din? So he brings from the Malam al Ashkar that it's asr. Why? Because you're touching the guf of the ois is guf echad. And now you're adding to the guf echad, you're creating a new letter, and that's you're creating a new letter out of something else. You're not writing a letter. This is a new letter that's being created. So, but to make from a dalet a hey, that's mutter. Or to make, because you're not touching the gufa ois that's already there. Yeah. So, but he says no. But the kolboy and the rivash and all the other poskim say you're allowed to make from a reish a dalet. You're allowed to make from a dalet a reish. You're allowed to make from a chaf a beis. You're allowed to make from a beis a chaf. Reish. You can make a reish into a ches. You can make a ches into a taf. Why? Because you're not changing the letter, even though it's gufa ois. All you're doing is you're adding to the letter. Now it comes, in Sifkot Lamed Zayin, comes a very interesting shaila. Also, an interesting chak teiches. I don't know if you know, but by us, the Ashkenazim, we don't write. There's no J. We don't have a J sound in the get. We do Dalet Zayin Shin. Joe is Dalet Zayin Shin, 3 letters. By this Fardim, Joe is a gimel with a little dot on top of it. So what happens if a dot falls on top of the gimel of Gamliel? So now who's going to read the get? It's going to be Gamliel. It's not his name. Shin Hashem. A, do you have to erase the dot? Because now it changed the Shin Hashem. B, are you allowed to erase the name? Because the same svara as before, does chak teiches apply to creating a word or not? Or in his lashon, Mali, if you change, what difference is there to me if I change the havara size or I change the tzura size? A gimel with a dot on top is a different letter. I erased the dot from on top of the gimel, it went from a gimel to a gimel. And maybe it should be compared to having a hay and you erased the bottom of the hay and you made it into a dalet. Because a dalet and a hay is 2 separate versions, and the gimel and the gimel is 2 separate things. So he says, according to the Ma'arik and Rabbeinu Peretz, it would be mutar. But the Get Pashat says he's machmer even b'di'evet to erase it. Because then, it's a gimel with a dot, a separate letter, is different than a gimel. He then mentions over there, if coffee or something, or a darkish liquid falls on top of the get, and you can still clearly see, talking about obviously it's coffee with milk that fell on top of a get, so it's brown, but it's not black, and you can still see the letter pretty clearly from under it, it's kosher. But if a drop of ink fell on top of it, that if you would let the drop dry, the letter would no longer be visible, and you went and you took a tissue and you absorbed it before it dried up. You swallowed it with a tissue. There's a way to do it. You swallowed all the ink and now it didn't spread. He says that is machmer, because there's no difference between lach and yavish. If a drop of wax falls on top of the letter or inside the letter, even if it's not nikar, you could scrape it off. And there's no chak teiches. That's what the Pri Chodosh says. That's what this is all in the Pri Chodosh says in the name of the Magen Avraham. The Pri Chodosh also says regarding the shin of 4 heads from the Marikash, it's obviously completely puzzle. He says if it's in the Toiref, it's a shin of 4 heads, it's bottom of the Raisa. If you do the scraping, it's a chak teiches, and if it's a Toifes, it's possible to do the Seifrim. Regarding making a base in a chaf into a base, or making a reish into a dal, this says there's no place for that chumra bichlal. He says that even though, another point that the Pri Chodosh says, even though the Chalkas Mechaykik says that there's no adding, where he says there's no making from a dalad a reish, or making from a reish a dal. This is both of them. It's not a problem b'chol.
I think that letter says that you're allowed to add, you can't make from a dal reish.
By get to make from a dal the reish, based he says is by get they do even from a, according to Shasat Chak, you do even from a dal the reish. Sometimes, not chatchila.
Okay, from a dal reish is not a problem, because you can waste it. But to make from a reish a dal,
you're adding it in the end.
What?
Both ways is enough svaras which are matir, because and I'm telling you the Pri Chodosh is makel on both. Pischei Tshuva in Sifkot Yud Gimel discusses what the Beis Shmuel says, that if it's not nikar ois, it's bottom midiraisa, it's not only possible with divrei seifrim. And he brings in the Beis Meir that it's obvious it's only possible with the Rabban. There's no such thing as bottom midiraisa by chak teiches in such a scenario. And he says when the get pashut you can apply the same thing. Now, the Pischei Tshuva continues and says that if the letters got glued to themselves, that means the yud of the pei or the legs or whatever it is, since this is a machlokes, if it's kosher without a tikkun, or if you bichlal need a tikkun, you could rely on the smack that you could be mesaken in a mokim igun and sha'as hatchak, but only if it happened if the touching occurred only after the letter was written kesikuna. This is all from the Beis Meir. Now, regarding the drop of wax that he says that it's mashma from the get pashut that he's noit to be machmir, and the Pri Chodosh is mekel. The Pischei Tshuva says, even though the get pashut is noit to be machmir, the get mekusher completely disagrees with him. But the Pischei Tshuva makes a pshara. The get pashut holds that if a wax falls on it, you can't remove it, and there's helfnisht. It's like nafal tipas yeh. The Beis Meir says that if shaiva falls on it, you could it's not a problem b'chlal. So it's b'chlal not a problem b'chatchila to even give it like that. Nothing. So the Pischei Tshuva takes a middle approach. He says, if the wax is still on the get, so if you could give it or not. If you remove the wax, it's for sure kosher. He says and then he says regarding what the Ramah says, that yesh machmirim even by nikar ha'ois. He brings the Maramri that it's only in the Toiref, even by Toiref or machmir, even by mokim igun. Maramri doesn't say that I get, and in the Toifes. And he says, Maramri, it says that Maramri understood from the Ramah that you machmer even b'mokim igun, and that's how also the Pri Chodosh also understood it that way. The Pri Chodosh says that's the mashmos of the Ramah, but we Sfardim B'chol don't have to follow it. He just points it out over there. So the Pischei Tshuva says B'chol not mashma gaf from the Marik was the shayrish of the Ramah. The Get Pashat says the same thing. And therefore, b'mokim igun shasat chak, you could, even according to the Marik, you could erase even b'toyref, even if it's touching the side of the letter, as long as the Tinnik reads it properly, you could do it. And he tells you, and the Ramo, which is machmir, has nothing to do with chak teiches. It's to do with mukav gvil. If it was not chak teiches, it would not be a problem. The fact is, the Marik is not machmir mitzad chak teiches. The Marik is machmir mitzad mukav gvil. Because it's only a chumrah because of mukav gvil, that's why, in certain scenarios, you could be, he says, since it's only mitzad mukav gvil, b'shatat chak v'mokim igun, you could do it without a problem. And therefore, he says, but l'chatchila, you definitely should be machmir. Then we'll finish one more thing, and then I guess the other sifim will wait for a different time. If a one drop of ink falls before you started writing, and you created a letter out of it, that's a whole big machlekes haposkim, and there is obviously l'chatchila, you're obviously machmir. If you're in a certain, if you're in a shasat chak, mokim igun, and all these things, there's certain times you could rely on it, but every single shasat chak and mokim igun that you're going to find, yes, there are people that say that every shasat chak makes it diavad l'chatchila, and in America it's all shasat chaks. It's not how you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to look at it, think each shasat chak and each b'diavad, and we're going to get to Mr. Hashem the next year, the difference between shasat chak and b'diavad, and when is a real shasat chak and when is a fake shasat chak.